The Jesuit priest who stepped ashore at Nagasaki in 1638 carried with him not only the instruments of faith, but also a barometer crafted in Rome, its mercury columns sealed within glass by artisans who understood the language of pressure, but not yet its celestial grammar. Father Alessandro Valignano had witnessed the typhoon that destroyed 14 Portuguese trading vessels 3 years prior, had seen the sea rise like a fist against the sky, and had concluded with the certainty of his age that such violence must serve divine pedagogy, though the instrument in his hands whispered of a different truth entirely. The shogunate officials who inspected his belongings that day examined the barometer with the same suspicion they reserved for crucifixes, recognizing in its strange liquid ascent and descent something that measured what should remain beyond measurement, and in this recognition lay the shadow of a question that would haunt 3 centuries, whether understanding the forces of nature diminished their terror or merely revealed how much more there was to fear. In the winter of 1703, a storm gathered over the North Sea with such methodical precision that fishermen from Friesland to Norfolk later swore they had felt its approach in their very bones, a dull ache that settled into joints and sinews 2 days before the wind arrived. Daniel Defoe, not yet famous for his tale of Crusoe but already consumed by the compulsion to document, moved through the wreckage of London afterward with notebook in hand, recording testimonies of chimney stacks that flew through the air like javelins, of lead rolled up from church roofs as though it were parchment, of the Eddystone lighthouse vanished into the sea with its keeper Henry Winstanley, who had boasted he wished only to be in his lighthouse during the greatest storm that ever was. The death toll reached 8,000 souls across England alone, yet what disturbed Defoe more than the mortality was the pattern he detected in survivor accounts, the way the wind had seemed to possess intention, selecting certain structures for annihilation while leaving adjacent buildings untouched, as though the atmosphere itself had developed preferences. He could not have known that he was documenting pressure gradients and the Coriolis effect decades before those terms entered scientific vocabulary. Could not have imagined that the isobars wrapping around the low-pressure centre of that tempest followed mathematical rules as precise as planetary orbits, and his incomprehension lent his eventual published account a quality of supernatural dread that raw meteorological data would never capture. The physician who attended Empress Maria Theresa in Vienna kept meticulous records of her headaches, noting with the obsessiveness of 18th century medicine that her migraines intensified precisely 23 hours before thunderstorms arrived over the Habsburg Palace, a correlation he attributed to an excess of melancholic humours disturbed by celestial influence. In truth, his royal patient was responding to infrasound, those frequencies below human hearing that propagate ahead of storm fronts, vibrating through tissue and bone, triggering responses in the limbic system that our ancestors might have recognized as the approach of danger, but that Enlightenment science had no framework to measure. The Empress herself, possessed of a pragmatic intelligence that had sustained her through 2 wars of succession, cared nothing for the theoretical cause, and simply learned to evacuate her court from the summer pavilion when the familiar pressure began building behind her eyes. Her physician's journals, discovered in the Hofburg archives in 1891, were dismissed as the superstitious ravings of pre-scientific medicine, yet they contained 8 years of data that perfectly correlated barometric pressure changes with physiological symptoms, a dataset any modern meteorologist would envy, rendered useless by the conceptual poverty of the age that produced it. Benjamin Franklin's kite flew into history on a June afternoon in 1752, though the date remains disputed and the event itself may be largely apocryphal. But what is not in question is that Franklin had already spent 2 years observing that storms in Philadelphia came from the southwest, that they moved northeast along the Atlantic coast, and that winds during a storm often blew from directions opposite to the storm's travel. This paradox consumed him, because it suggested that storms possessed internal structure, that they were not mere eruptions of atmospheric chaos but organised systems with anatomy and behaviour. When he proposed to the Royal Society that lightning was electrical in nature, he was not merely identifying a phenomenon but suggesting that the forces of nature spoke the same language as the forces humans had already begun to harness in primitive batteries and electrostatic generators. The implications terrified his contemporaries more than comforted them, for if lightning obeyed natural law, then so too might earthquakes, floods, and pestilence, and the entire architecture of divine intervention would require reconstruction. The lightning rod that Franklin subsequently invented became controversial not for technical reasons, but theological ones. The Abbé Nollet in Paris argued that to deflect heaven's fire was to interfere with divine judgment, that buildings struck by lightning had earned their destruction through the sins committed within their walls, and that Franklin's rods represented a dangerous hubris that would inevitably provoke celestial retaliation on a grander scale. The Lisbon earthquake struck at 9:40 in the morning on November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day, when the churches were full and the candles lit, and the subsequent fires consumed what the shaking had spared, while a tsunami 20 feet high swept through the Tagus estuary to complete the destruction. 50,000 died in a city of 200,000, and the intellectual convulsion that followed proved almost as violent as the geological one. Because Lisbon was not some provincial outpost, but the capital of a global empire, a centre of trade and learning, and its devastation suggested that divine protection correlated poorly with righteousness. Voltaire seized upon the disaster for his poem Sur le désastre de Lisbonne, demolating Leibnizian optimism with the rubble of collapsed cathedrals, while the Marquis de Pombal, who took control of the city's reconstruction, commissioned the first systematic survey of earthquake effects, sending questionnaires to every parish in Portugal asking about the direction of shaking, the sequence of tremors, the behaviour of animals beforehand, and the nature of water disturbances in wells and springs. This data, compiled in hundreds of pages of testimony, represented the birth of seismology as a science, though the instruments to measure what Pombal's witnesses described would not be invented for another century. The questionnaire asked whether dogs had behaved strangely before the shaking, whether birds had fled, whether fish had been seen behaving erratically in the Tagus, and the overwhelming affirmative responses suggested that human perception occupied only a narrow band within a spectrum of natural phenomena, that animals sensed the P-waves that travelled through the Earth's crust seconds before the more destructive S-waves arrived, and that the forces of nature announced themselves to those with appropriate receptors while leaving humans blind until the violence was upon them. In 1783, the Leki fissure in Iceland erupted with such sustained fury that it continued for 8 months, vomiting 120 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, and the consequences rippled across the northern hemisphere with the inexorability of falling dominoes. The sun dimmed over Europe, filtered through a high-altitude haze that turned summer skies the colour of tarnished brass, and temperatures plummeted even as lava fountains continued to rage across the Icelandic highlands. In France, the crop failures that followed contributed to bread shortages that would, within 6 years, help ignite revolution, the path from volcanic eruption to guillotine traceable through grain prices and peasant grievances. Though no contemporary observer connected these phenomena, in Japan, the Tenmei famine began as the same atmospheric veil circled the globe, and crop failures there killed perhaps 300,000 through starvation and attendant disease, while in the Nile Valley, the failure of summer rains reduced the river's flood to a trickle, and chronicles from Cairo describe grain riots and mass death. The Reverend Gilbert White in Hampshire noted in his journal that the summer sun could be examined with the naked eye, that it appeared the colour of hot iron seen through smoke, and that a strange fog persisted despite the absence of clouds, but he attributed these phenomena to local causes, lacking the conceptual framework to imagine that Icelandic fire could dim English skies. Benjamin Franklin, then in Paris negotiating the terms of American independence, did make the connection, proposing in a paper to the Literary and Philosophical Society of Manchester that the European haze originated from volcanic activity, but his insight generated little traction because the mechanism by which solid earth could influence transparent air seemed to require impossible leaps across the categories into which natural philosophy had divided the world. The year without a summer arrived in 1816, following the eruption of Mount Tambora in the Dutch East Indies the previous April, an explosion so violent that it removed the top 4,000 feet of the mountain and killed an estimated 71,000 people through direct effects and subsequent starvation. The sound of the eruption carried 3,000 miles, heard as distant cannon fire in Sumatra, and the darkness that followed was absolute within a 40-mile radius as the ash column reached the stratosphere. But the true impact played out in the following months as the aerosol clouds spread across both hemispheres, reflecting solar radiation back into space and dropping global temperatures by 0.5 degrees Celsius, a seemingly trivial shift that translated into catastrophic crop failures across Europe and North America. In Vermont, snow fell in June, killing newly planted crops, and frost struck every month of the summer, while in Switzerland the Alpine glaciers advanced, grinding downslope through previously temperate valleys, and the resulting hunger drove rural families into cities already strained by the economic disruptions following Napoleon's final defeat. Mary Shelley, confined by incessant rain to a villa on Lake Geneva, began writing Frankenstein during this summer that never arrived, and her tale of unnatural creation emerged from an unnaturally darkened world. The monster assembled from corpses gestating in the same gloom that hung over Europe's fields. Lord Byron, confined to the same villa, wrote Darkness, a poem describing a sunless world where morn came and brought no day, capturing with poetic precision the psychological horror of disrupted natural rhythms, of forces that refused to adhere to their appointed cycles, and the verse carried a documentary accuracy that Byron himself did not fully appreciate, because he attributed the darkness to local weather rather than recognizing it as a global atmospheric phenomenon. The Royal Navy's hydrographic surveys of the 1820s and 1830s, driven by the practical need to chart safe passages for an empire that depended on maritime commerce, accumulated vast quantities of data on currents, tides, and wind patterns, and from this massive observation, Lieutenant Matthew Fontaine Maury of the United States Navy began to discern the ocean's circulatory system, the great gyres that moved water across entire ocean basins in patterns as regular as clockwork, yet driven by forces that remained incompletely theorized. Maury's Physical Geography of the Sea, published in 1855, represented the first attempt to synthesize global ocean dynamics, proposing that winds drove surface currents, that temperature differences created vertical circulation, and that these movements of water influenced climate across continents. Yet his work was received with skepticism by scientific establishments that found his lack of formal training more significant than his data. The whale ship captains and merchant mariners who actually used Maury's current charts to shorten passage times cared nothing for academic credentials. And the commercial success of his work created the peculiar situation where practical navigation advanced ahead of theoretical understanding, where humans exploited natural forces they could describe but not yet explain. Maury himself believed that ocean currents were maintained by divine design, that the same intelligence that set the planets in motion had ordained the Gulf Stream's path, and this theological interpretation coexisted uneasily with his meticulous empiricism, the data suggesting mechanistic causes while his worldview demanded purposeful design. The Carrington event of September 1859 announced itself first to British astronomer Richard Carrington, who was projecting an image of the Sun onto a white screen in his private observatory, when he observed an enormous solar flare erupt from a cluster of sunspots, a brightening so intense that it was visible in projected daylight. Within 18 hours, auroras appeared as far south as the Caribbean and Hawaii, visible even at the equator, and the telegraph systems of Europe and North America went mad. Operators reporting that their instruments sparked and shocked them, that messages transmitted themselves without battery power, as the induced currents from the geomagnetic storm overwhelmed the electrical infrastructure that humanity had only recently constructed. In Washington, telegraph operator Frederick Royce discovered he could disconnect his batteries entirely and transmit messages to Portland using only the current induced by the fluctuating magnetic field, a phenomenon that demonstrated the planet's vulnerability to solar emissions while simultaneously revealing the intimate connection between celestial and terrestrial electrical systems. The auroral displays were so brilliant that miners in the Rocky Mountains woke at 1 a.m. believing dawn had arrived and began preparing breakfast, while newspapers reported that ordinary print could be read by aurora light at midnight in southern latitudes where such displays had never been recorded. Carrington himself was cautious about attributing the geomagnetic disturbance to the solar flare he had observed, noting only that one swallow does not make a summer, yet he recognized that if the correlation was real, it meant the sun's influence on Earth extended far beyond light and heat, that the space between celestial bodies was not empty void, but rather filled with invisible emanations that could wreak havoc on technological systems. The Krakatoa eruption of August 1883 generated the loudest sound in recorded human history, the pressure wave circling the globe 4 times and remaining detectable on barographs for days afterward, while the tsunamis that radiated from the collapsing volcanic island killed 36,000 people, along the coasts of Java and Sumatra. The explosion vaporized 6 cubic miles of rock, and the resulting dust clouds circled the Earth for years, creating spectacular sunset displays that were recorded in the paintings of European artists who had no knowledge of their Indonesian origin, unconscious documentarians of atmospheric optics modified by volcanic particulates. William Ashcroft, an artist in London, produced hundreds of pastel sketches of the vivid sunsets between 1883 and 1886, capturing the intensified reds and purples that resulted from light scattering through the stratospheric aerosol layer, and modern analysis of his colour choices has allowed volcanologists to estimate the density and dispersion of the Krakatoa dust cloud with surprising precision. The explosion itself had been heard in Perth, Australia, over 2,000 miles away, heard on Rodriguez Island in the Indian Ocean nearly 3,000 miles distant, and this acoustic feat remained unmatched until thermonuclear testing in the 1950s, the sheer acoustic energy representing a natural release of power that dwarfed anything human technology could then produce. The Royal Society commissioned a comprehensive report on Krakatoa that ran to hundreds of pages, compiling observations from around the world, and this document represented a watershed in the scientific study of catastrophic natural events, the first time that a global network of observers had simultaneously documented a single phenomenon from multiple continents, creating a dataset that revealed how interconnected atmospheric and oceanic systems truly were. The Galveston hurricane of September 1900 remains the deadliest natural disaster in United States history, killing between 6,000 and 12,000 people in a city that had been assured by its own meteorologists that hurricanes posed no serious threat to the Texas coast. The storm surge, 15 feet high and driven by winds exceeding 135 miles per hour, swept across a barrier island whose highest natural elevation was less than 9 feet above sea level, and the city's infrastructure, its homes and commercial buildings, its churches and schools, was obliterated in a matter of hours. Isaac Klein, the meteorologist in charge of the Galveston Weather Bureau office, had published an article in 1891 dismissing the possibility of a destructive hurricane at Galveston, arguing that the city's geographical position and the configuration of the Gulf Coast provided natural protection, and this professional assurance had contributed to civic complacency and the failure to evacuate when warnings became available. Klein himself lost his pregnant wife in the storm, his house collapsing while he clung to his children in the wreckage, and he spent the remainder of his career studying hurricanes with an intensity sharpened by guilt and grief, becoming an advocate for improved forecasting and coastal defences, though he never publicly acknowledged that his earlier dismissal of the threat had contributed to the city's vulnerability. The Galveston disaster prompted the US Weather Bureau to develop systematic hurricane tracking protocols, establishing a network of observers across the Caribbean and training meteorologists to recognize the atmospheric signatures of developing tropical cyclones. But the tools available in the early 20th century remained primitive, dependent on scattered observations from ships and coastal stations, offering glimpses of storm structure without the comprehensive surveillance that would later become available through aircraft reconnaissance and satellite imagery. The Tunguska event of June 30, 1908, flattened 800 square miles of Siberian forest with an air blast estimated at 15 megatons, the explosion occurring at an altitude of 3 to 6 miles above the ground, and for decades the cause remained mysterious because no crater was found, no meteorite fragments recovered, only the devastating pattern of radial treefall extending outward from the epicenter. The remoteness of the location meant that scientific investigation did not begin until 1927, when Leonid Kulik led the first expedition to the site, and what he found confused rather than clarified the picture. Trees standing at ground zero, stripped of branches but still vertical, surrounded by forests laid flat in a radial pattern, with the direction of treefall indicating an aerial explosion. Kulik's expedition and subsequent investigations by Soviet scientists generated theories ranging from meteor impacts to volcanic explosions to antimatter annihilation, but the most likely explanation, now supported by computer modelling and atmospheric physics, is that a stony asteroid perhaps 120 feet in diameter entered the atmosphere at approximately 34,000 miles per hour and disintegrated in a massive airburst, releasing energy equivalent to the largest thermonuclear weapons ever tested. The event passed almost unnoticed globally in 1908 because it occurred in one of Earth's most sparsely populated regions, but had the same asteroid arrived 4 hours and 47 minutes later, Earth's rotation would have placed St. Petersburg under the blast point, and Russian history might have taken a dramatically different course, the Romanov dynasty potentially ending not with revolution, but with misinterpreted celestial violence. The Tunguska event demonstrated that forces capable of destroying civilization arrive from directions humanity had scarcely considered, that the sky held threats against which there was no defense, and in 1908, barely any awareness. The dust storms that began sweeping across the American Great Plains in 1931 intensified through the decade until the region acquired the designation Dust Bowl, a catastrophe that combined drought, wind, and agricultural practices into a self-reinforcing cycle of environmental destruction. The native prairie grasses that had stabilized the soil for millennia had been ploughed under during the agricultural expansion of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and when the rains failed in the early 1930s, there remained nothing to anchor the topsoil against the wind. On April 14th in 1935, a dust storm of unprecedented scale rolled across the southern plains, a wall of soil particles rising thousands of feet into the air and advancing like a solid front, darkening the sky so completely that midday became midnight. And this single storm, later known as Black Sunday, stripped topsoil from millions of acres, depositing it hundreds of miles downwind in drifts that buried fences and farm equipment. The human cost was measured not only in the hundreds who died from dust pneumonia, their lungs clogged with the fine silica particles that no mask could filter, but also in the mass migration that followed, the 3.5 million people who abandoned the plains for California and other states, an internal refugee crisis driven by environmental collapse. The Dust Bowl represented a case study in how human activity could amplify natural forces, how the removal of vegetative cover transformed normal drought into catastrophic desertification, and how quickly an ecosystem could unravel when its stabilizing elements were removed. Soil conservation practices that seem obvious in retrospect, contour ploughing and windbreaks, crop rotation and fallowing, were developed in response to this disaster, knowledge purchased at the price of ruined farms and broken communities. The 1938 New England hurricane arrived without warning because the atmospheric reconnaissance capabilities of the era could not track storms once they moved beyond the range of coastal observation stations, and the Weather Bureau had assured the region that the hurricane then located off the Carolina coast would curve eastward into the Atlantic as tropical systems normally did at that latitude. Instead, the storm accelerated northward at 55 miles per hour, driven by an unusual configuration of the jet stream, and made landfall on Long Island with sustained winds of 121 miles per hour, Category 3 intensity, the forward momentum of the storm adding to the rotational winds to create gusts exceeding 180 miles per hour on elevated terrain. The storm surge along the Connecticut and Rhode Island coast reached 17 to 25 feet, sweeping away coastal communities that had no warning to evacuate, and the death toll reached at least 682, with hundreds more missing and presumed dead. The hurricane's rapid forward motion meant that it maintained destructive winds well inland, devastating forests across Vermont and New Hampshire, and the total timber loss exceeded 2 billion board feet, enough to build 200,000 houses, the forestry impact creating fire hazards that persisted for years as the deadwood dried. The 1938 storm shattered the assumption that major hurricanes would not strike New England, revealing that the historical record of the previous century, which had been relatively quiet, represented only a small sample of possible atmospheric behaviour, and that the forces of nature recognised no permanent boundaries, that the same waters that spawned Caribbean hurricanes could deliver them to Massachusetts under the right conditions. The London smog of December 1952 killed approximately 12,000 people in 4 days, though the full mortality was not recognised for months because deaths were initially attributed to individual respiratory and cardiac incidents rather than to a collective environmental catastrophe. A temperature inversion trapped pollution from coal fires, vehicle exhaust, and industrial emissions close to the ground, and the fog that naturally formed in London's damp winter air mixed with the smoke to create a toxic aerosol that reduced visibility to mere feet and infiltrated buildings, theatres reporting that audiences could not see the stage, hospitals finding their wards filled with patients struggling to breathe. The particulate concentration reached levels that modern air quality indices do not even contemplate, and the sulfur dioxide combined with the fog to create dilute sulfuric acid that corroded metal and stone, killed houseplants, and burned human lung tissue. The disaster prompted the Clean Air Act of 1956, which restricted coal burning in urban areas and began the process of reducing British air pollution. But the 1952 smog demonstrated how natural atmospheric conditions, in this case, the temperature inversion, could interact with human pollution to create forces as deadly as any hurricane or earthquake. How the capacity for catastrophe emerged from the combination of natural phenomena and industrial civilization. The victims died not from an external assault but from breathing the air of their own city, killed by the accumulated emissions of daily life concentrated by meteorological chance. And this inversion of the ordinary into the lethal revealed that the forces of nature had become entangled with human activity in ways that blurred the distinction between natural disaster and anthropogenic catastrophe. The Valdivia earthquake of May 22, 1960, registered magnitude 9.5, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded by seismometers, and the rupture propagated along 600 miles of the Chilean coast, dropping some areas 8 feet and raising others 6 feet in a matter of minutes, fundamentally redrawing the geography of southern Chile. The subsequent tsunami radiated across the Pacific, killing 61 people in Hawaii 15 hours after the earthquake, and striking the Japanese coast 22 hours after the initial rupture, where it killed 142 people and destroyed over 1,500 homes, demonstrating that the ocean could transmit destructive energy across its entire basin with minimal attenuation. The death toll in Chile itself exceeded 5,000, though accurate counts proved impossible because entire communities were erased by the earthquake, the tsunami, and the subsequent eruption of Cordon Caule volcano, which began venting ash and lava 2 days after the earthquake, the seismic shaking apparently having disturbed the magmatic plumbing beneath the Andes. The Valdivia earthquake provided the first modern data set for a magnitude 9 event, and the seismograms from around the world revealed that the entire planet had resonated, that the energy released by the rupturing fault had set Earth vibrating like a struck bell, the oscillations detectable for weeks after the main shock. The earthquake also demonstrated the limitations of magnitude scales, because although magnitude 9.5 represented only a modest numerical increase over magnitude 9.0, the actual energy release was nearly twice as large, the logarithmic scale compressing vast differences into small increments that did not convey the exponential increase in destructive power. Hurricane Camille made landfall on the Mississippi coast on August 17, 1969, with sustained winds estimated at 190 miles per hour, the second most intense hurricane to strike the United States in the 20th century, and the storm surge reached 24.6 feet, sweeping away entire neighborhoods along the Gulf Coast. The barometric pressure in the eye measured 905 millibars, one of the lowest pressures ever recorded in a landfalling Atlantic hurricane, and the pressure gradient drove winds of such intensity that official anemometers were destroyed, leaving wind speeds to be estimated from structural damage. 23 people died in a beachfront apartment building in Pass Christian, Mississippi, where residents had gathered for a hurricane party, dismissing evacuation orders because the building had survived previous storms and their bodies were found scattered across the landscape. Some never recovered from the waters that had carried them miles inland. Camille then tracked northward, weakening over land, but when the remnant system encountered the Appalachian Mountains, it stalled over central Virginia and dropped up to 31 inches of rain in 8 hours, creating catastrophic flooding that killed 153 people, more than died in the coastal storm surge. The Virginia flooding demonstrated that hurricane impacts extended far beyond the coastal wind and surge, that the moisture transported by tropical systems represented a separate hazard that could manifest hundreds of miles from the ocean, and that the inland geography of mountains and valleys could transform diminishing tropical systems into devastating flood events through orographic enhancement of rainfall. The polar cyclone of November 12, 1970 struck the Ganges Delta region of East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, with a storm surge that may have reached 30 feet, sweeping across islands and coastal areas where hundreds of thousands lived at elevations barely above sea level, and the death toll reached at least 300,000 and possibly 500,000, making it the deadliest tropical cyclone in recorded history. The flat deltic landscape offered no elevated refuge, and the warning systems of the time were inadequate to alert the scattered rural population, many of whom had no access to radio or other communications and who depended on traditional storm signals that failed to convey the magnitude of the approaching disaster. the cyclone's human toll was amplified by poverty, by the vulnerability of populations living in marginal environments with no resources to construct storm-resistant shelter or to evacuate to distant safe zones, and the disaster became entangled with the political tensions between East and West Pakistan, the perceived inadequacy of the central government's relief response, contributing to the grievances that would, within a year, erupt into civil war and the birth of Bangladesh. The Bola cyclone demonstrated that the forces of nature exacted their highest tolls where poverty, geography, and political marginalization converged, that vulnerability to natural hazards was not randomly distributed but rather concentrated among populations already struggling with multiple forms of deprivation, and that casualty statistics represented not merely meteorological events, but also failures of development, governance, and equity. The eruption of Mount St. Helens on May 18, 1980, began with a magnitude 5.1 earthquake that triggered the collapse of the volcano's north flank, the largest landslide in recorded history, releasing the pressure on the magma chamber and producing a lateral blast that devastated 230 square miles of forest. The explosive force directed horizontally rather than vertically, a geological peculiarity that caught scientists and loggers by surprise. Volcanologist David Johnston, stationed at an observation post 6 miles from the summit, radioed Vancouver, this is it, before being killed by the blast, one of 57 people who died despite the extensive monitoring and evacuation efforts preceding the eruption. The landslide and blast were followed by a vertical eruption column that reached 15 miles into the atmosphere, depositing ash across the western United States and circling the globe within weeks, and the entire sequence of events was documented by a combination of seismometers, cameras, and eyewitness accounts that provided unprecedented detail about the mechanics of explosive volcanism. The lateral blast travelled at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, flattening forests in a radial pattern extending 17 miles from the volcano, and the temperatures within the blast exceeded 700 degrees Fahrenheit, incinerating everything organic and leaving a grey wasteland of toppled trees aligned like scattered toothpicks. Mount St. Helens demonstrated that volcanoes could erupt in ways that defied the models built from Hawaiian and Italian volcanism, that each volcanic system possessed individual characteristics that required direct observation to understand, and that the forces contained within Earth's crust could rearrange landscapes in minutes, removing mountaintops and filling valleys with debris and timescales that made human history seem glacially slow. The 1993 storm of the century struck the eastern United States in March, affecting states from Florida to Maine, and killing 318 people, a massive extratropical cyclone that generated blizzard conditions across the Appalachians, tornadoes in Florida, and a storm surge along the Gulf Coast that rivaled hurricane impacts. The storm's barometric pressure dropped to 960 millibars, equivalent to a Category 3 hurricane, but its structure was fundamentally different, a baroclinic system deriving energy from temperature contrasts rather than the latent heat release that powers tropical cyclones, and its enormous size meant that destructive conditions extended across an area, exceeding the entire Atlantic seaboard. Snowfall totals reached 56 inches in the Appalachian Mountains, and the weight of the snow collapsed hundreds of roofs, while the combination of snow, wind, and cold killed people through exposure, carbon monoxide poisoning from improper heating, and traffic accidents on roads rendered impassable by whiteout conditions. The storm paralyzed a quarter of the US population, closing every major airport along the East Coast simultaneously, an event that revealed the vulnerability of interconnected infrastructure to widespread atmospheric disruptions, and the economic losses exceeded $6 billion, a figure that reflected not only direct damage, but also the cost of paralyzed commerce across multiple states for several days. The 1993 storm had been forecast with remarkable accuracy, the National Weather Service issuing warnings days in advance, but the scope of the event exceeded public comprehension, the warnings seeming hyperbolic until the snow began to fall and the wind began to howl, and this gap between forecast accuracy and public response highlighted the challenge of communicating extreme events when the extremity itself lay beyond common experience. The Indian Ocean tsunami of December 26, 2004 was triggered by a magnitude 9.1 earthquake off the coast of Sumatra, the third largest earthquake ever recorded, and the resulting tsunami waves reached heights of 100 feet near the epicenter, spreading across the Indian Ocean basin to kill 230,000 people in 14 countries. one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. The earthquake ruptured a fault segment more than 800 miles long, displacing the seafloor vertically by several meters and setting in motion waves that travelled at jet aircraft speeds across deep water, slowing and amplifying as they approached shallow coastal areas. The tsunami struck the Aceh province of Indonesia within minutes, offering no time for warning, but the waves took 2 hours to reach Thailand and Sri Lanka, and 7 hours to reach Somalia. Yet in 2004 there existed no Indian Ocean tsunami warning system, no infrastructure to detect the waves and alert distant coastlines, and people died from a hazard that could have been anticipated with available technology. The videographic documentation of the tsunami represented the first time such an event had been extensively recorded by amateur cameras and mobile phones, and the footage revealed the terrifying dynamics of tsunami inundation. The initial withdrawal of water from the coast, exposing reefs and seafloor, the arrival of the wave not as a breaking surf but as a rapidly rising tide that accelerated inland. The churning debris field that transformed buildings, vehicles and vegetation into battering rams that multiplied the destructive force. The 2004 tsunami prompted the establishment of ocean-wide warning systems, the deployment of deep ocean pressure sensors that could detect passing tsunami waves, and international protocols for rapid alert dissemination, a response that demonstrated humanity's capacity to learn from catastrophe, but also the tragic reality that such learning typically occurred only after massive loss of life had demonstrated the necessity. Hurricane Katrina made landfall on the Louisiana coast on August 29, 2005, as a Category 3 hurricane, but the storm surge it generated reached 28 feet in some locations, overwhelming the levee system that protected New Orleans and flooding 80% of the city, a disaster that killed at least 1,800 people and displaced hundreds of thousands, exposing the fragility of infrastructure built to protect a city much of which lay below sea level. The flooding of New Orleans resulted not primarily from the hurricane winds, but from the failure of levees and flood walls that had been designed to withstand lower surge levels, and subsequent investigations revealed that the structures had been inadequately designed and constructed, that the US Army Corps of Engineers had used flawed assumptions about soil mechanics and storm probabilities, and that the very defences meant to protect the city had created a false sense of security that encouraged development in areas that were fundamentally vulnerable. The images of New Orleans underwater, of people trapped on rooftops awaiting rescue, of bodies floating in the floodwaters, shocked the nation and revealed that American cities were vulnerable to catastrophic failure when natural forces exceeded engineering assumptions, that the forces of nature did not respect the nominal protections of levees and pumps, and that poverty and race correlated with vulnerability, the poorest neighbourhoods suffering the worst flooding and the slowest recovery. Katrina's economic impact exceeded $125 billion, making it the costliest natural disaster in US history. But the costs extended beyond economics to include the dissolution of communities, the trauma of displacement, and the revelation that governance at all levels could fail catastrophically when faced with a disaster that exceeded planning assumptions and overwhelmed response capabilities. The Tohoku earthquake and tsunami of March 11, 2011, struck off the northeastern coast of Japan with magnitude 9.1, generating a tsunami that reached heights of 133 feet and travelled up to 6 miles inland, overtopping seawalls that had been built to protect coastal communities and killing nearly 20,000 people, despite Japan's extensive earthquake preparedness and early warning systems. The earthquake moved the main island of Honshu 8 feet eastward, shifted Earth's axis by approximately 4 inches, and released energy equivalent to 23,000 Hiroshima bombs. Yet the buildings in Tokyo, equipped with sophisticated seismic dampers and flexible designs, sustained minimal damage, demonstrating that engineering could mitigate earthquake forces when resources and expertise were available. The tsunami, however, exceeded the design parameters of coastal defences, and the waves penetrated the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, flooding the emergency generators meant to power cooling systems after the earthquake had severed external power, and the subsequent meltdown of 3 reactors transformed a natural disaster into a technological catastrophe that required the evacuation of hundreds of thousands and created an exclusion zone that remains partially uninhabited years later. The Fukushima disaster demonstrated that natural forces could cascade through technological systems in ways that planners had not anticipated, that the backup systems designed to handle earthquakes or tsunamis individually could fail when both occurred simultaneously, and that the forces of nature possessed the capacity to transform advanced industrial facilities into hazard sources that amplified and prolonged the initial disaster. The earthquake and tsunami also generated global reverberations through supply chains, as Japanese factories that produce specialized components for industries worldwide ceased operation, revealing the interdependence of modern manufacturing and the vulnerability of globalized production to localized natural disasters. The 2013 Chelyabinsk meteor entered Earth's atmosphere over Russia on February 15th, exploding with an energy release estimated at 400 to 500 kilotons, approximately 25 times the Hiroshima bomb, and the resulting shockwave blew out windows across the city, injuring more than 1,500 people from flying glass, the first significant human casualty toll from a meteor impact in recorded history. The meteor, approximately 65 feet in diameter and travelling at 40,000 miles per hour, was not detected prior to impact because it approached from the direction of the Sun, where Earth-based telescopes are blind, and the explosion occurred without warning at an altitude of 14 miles, the airburst creating a fireball brighter than the Sun visible across a region of hundreds of miles. Dashboard cameras in Russian vehicles captured the meteor's approach and explosion from multiple angles, providing unprecedented documentation of a bolide entry and airburst. An analysis of the footage allowed scientists to reconstruct the meteor's trajectory, velocity, and fragmentation pattern with precision that would have been impossible without this accidental surveillance network. The Chelyabinsk event occurred on the same day that asteroid 2012 DA14 made a close approach to Earth, passing within 17,000 miles closer than geosynchronous satellites, and while the two objects were unrelated, their temporal coincidence emphasized that Earth moves through a cosmic shooting gallery, where impacts from space are not theoretical but inevitable, their timing and location merely probabilistic. The explosion over Chelyabinsk released energy sufficient to destroy a city had it occurred at ground level rather than at altitude, and the event prompted renewed attention to near-Earth object detection and planetary defense. The recognition that the forces of nature include not only atmospheric and geological phenomena, but also astronomical hazards against which there existed no warning system and no defense. The Australian bushfires of 2019 and 2020 burned 46 million acres, destroyed over 5,000 buildings, and killed at least 34 people directly, while the smoke and air pollution are estimated to have contributed to hundreds of additional deaths, the fires generating such intense heat that they created their own weather systems, pyrocumulonimbus clouds that produced lightning, which ignited additional fires and created fire tornadoes with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. The fires burned with such intensity that they were visible from space as glowing fronts hundreds of miles long, and the smoke plumes rose into the stratosphere, circling the southern hemisphere and affecting air quality in South America. The particulate emissions equivalent to industrial pollution from a medium-sized nation released in a matter of months. The bushfires were fueled by the driest conditions in recorded Australian history, temperatures that exceeded previous records, and fuel loads that had accumulated during years of suppressed burning, and the combination created fire behaviour that exceeded the experience of veteran firefighters, flames that jumped highways and fire breaks, that spotted miles ahead of the main fire front, and that rendered traditional suppression tactics ineffective. The ecological toll included the deaths of an estimated 3 billion animals, many from species already endangered, and the destruction of forests that had existed for millennia. Ecosystems that will require decades or centuries to recover, if recovery is possible at all, given the changing climate conditions that contributed to the fire's severity. The fires demonstrated that the forces of nature could be amplified by human alteration of atmospheric composition, that the carbon dioxide released by centuries of fossil fuel combustion had modified global temperatures and precipitation patterns in ways that increased the frequency and intensity of extreme fire weather, creating a feedback loop where fires released additional carbon, which further altered climate, which intensified future fire risk. The February 2021 North American cold wave plunged Texas into sub-zero temperatures, for which the state's infrastructure was not designed, freezing natural gas wellheads and pipelines, causing power plants to fail, and leaving millions without electricity during the coldest temperatures in 30 years. a disaster that killed at least 210 people from hypothermia, carbon monoxide poisoning, and other cold-related causes. The cold wave resulted from a displacement of the polar vortex, a stratospheric phenomenon where the normally stable circulation of air around the Arctic was disrupted, allowing frigid air to spill southward across North America, while simultaneously allowing warmer air to penetrate the Arctic, a redistribution of atmospheric heat that produced temperature anomalies exceeding 60 degrees Fahrenheit from normal in some locations. Texas had winterized its power infrastructure after a similar but less severe cold wave in 2011. But the winterization was voluntary rather than mandatory, and many power plants had not implemented the necessary protections because extended freezes were statistically rare and the expense seemed unjustified, a calculation that proved catastrophic when the 2021 cold wave arrived. The failure of the Texas electric grid during the cold wave revealed the vulnerability of modern civilization to natural forces that disrupted energy systems, that millions of people depended utterly on continuous electricity for heating, water, and communications, and that the loss of power cascaded through multiple systems, creating compound failures where water treatment plants shut down, causing pipes to freeze and burst, leading to water shortages that persisted after power was restored. The cold wave demonstrated that the forces of nature had not been tamed by technological advancement, that atmospheric dynamics could still produce conditions against which modern infrastructure proved fragile, and that risk assessments based on historical frequency could become obsolete when the climate system itself was changing in ways that altered the probability distribution of extreme events. The Hungatonga Hunga Ha'apai eruption of January 15, 2022, produced the largest atmospheric explosion in the instrumental era, the blast audible in Alaska over 6,000 miles away, and the eruption generated a tsunami that affected coastlines across the Pacific Basin, killed 6 people in Tonga, and produced measurable waves as far away as the Mediterranean Sea. The eruption was unusual because the volcano's vent was submerged in shallow water, and the interaction between magma and seawater created a phreatomagmatic explosion of exceptional violence. The eruption column reaching 36 miles into the mesosphere, higher than any other observed volcanic plume, and injecting an estimated 58,000 Olympic swimming pools worth of water vapor into the stratosphere, potentially affecting global climate for years. The pressure wave from the explosion propagated around the entire planet multiple times, detectable on barometers worldwide, and the atmospheric disturbance created unusual tsunami-like waves in distant locations, where conventional tsunami waves had not yet arrived, a phenomenon that confused initial warnings because the waves appeared before the seismically generated tsunami could have travelled the distance. The eruption severed the single submarine communications cable, connecting Tonga to the global internet, isolating the nation for weeks and demonstrating the fragility of communications infrastructure in the face of geological violence. That modern connectivity depended on physical cables vulnerable to forces that could snap fibre optics and tear apart submarine repeaters. The Hungatonga eruption reminded a globally connected civilization that the forces of nature could still produce phenomena beyond the scale of ordinary experience, that volcanic systems could explode with energy that dwarfed human technological capabilities, and that Earth's internal heat, accumulated over billions of years, could be released in instants that rearranged islands and disturbed the entire planetary atmosphere. Human civilization has existed for mere thousands of years against the backdrop of forces that have shaped the planet for billions, forces that continue to operate according to physical laws that care nothing for human presence or survival, and the accumulated experience of recorded disasters represents only the tiniest sample of what nature is capable of producing when the conditions align, when pressure gradients steepen, or tectonic stresses release, or celestial bodies intersect Earth's orbit at the wrong moment. The instruments we have developed to measure these forces, seismometers and satellites, Doppler radar and deep ocean sensors, provide unprecedented awareness, but also reveal how recently such awareness became possible, how for almost all of human history our ancestors faced the fury of storms and earthquakes and eruptions with no understanding of the mechanisms that drove them, no capacity to forecast or prepare beyond reading subtle signs that worked sometimes and failed catastrophically when the forces exceeded historical precedent. The narrative of humanity's relationship with natural forces is not one of progressive mastery, but rather of slowly accumulating knowledge that reveals ever more clearly how powerful those forces are. how our technological capabilities to predict have advanced far beyond our capabilities to prevent or even adequately protect against extreme events, and how the choices we make in where we build our cities, how we generate our energy, and how we modify our atmosphere are altering the frequency and intensity of some natural forces in ways that turn low-probability events into recurring catastrophes, whose costs compound with each iteration as more people and infrastructure concentrate in vulnerable locations under the assumption that engineering and forecasting have rendered us safe, when in truth we have merely borrowed time between the inevitable instances when the forces of nature express themselves at magnitudes against which our preparations prove inadequate.